O Lord of hosts, be with us, for we have none other help in times of adversity but Thee. O Lord of hosts, have mercy on us.
Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about how to prove God to an atheist. And so we're going to be getting into what is the transcendental argument for the existence of God, where does it come from, how does it work, and what are the implications of this argument? What are some of the critiques towards this argument? These are the things we're going to be tackling in today's video, and I'm really excited. I hope this becomes one of my most popular videos. So if you've been with me, please share this video. I hope it encounters as many atheists and non-believers as possible, because what is so great about this video is we're going to be using secular philosophical language to address, to highlight, to demonstrate the complete inadequacy and incoherency of the atheistic worldview. And so that's what I'm really excited to show you guys. And this is for anybody who may be a little bit familiar, not familiar. I hope after this video, you're going to feel comfortable with the transcendental argument and why the atheistic worldview is totally incoherent and can't be true, and therefore God must exist. And so what I'm doing is making a general theistic argument for the existence of God. And then on the last slide, I'm going to highlight how the conclusion is, okay, God exists. Therefore, the only real debate that's taking place, or should be taking place, is among faith traditions about which faith tradition is true. And I'm going to highlight just briefly that, of course, Orthodox Christian theology is going to come out on top, but that's a whole nother video in and of itself, but that will be addressed in the last slide that I want to show you guys. And so some of the stuff that I'm going to be saying has already been highlighted by other apologists, particularly in the Orthodox tradition. So I'm mentioning Jay Dyer here, and Father Deacon Ananias, the Norwegian News, his YouTube channel. So I am not unique here, I am not special, but what I am trying to do is break it down, put it in normal language for you guys so you can understand what it is, how it works, and how atheism is completely incoherent. So with that being said, let's just get into it. Okay, so the first slide here. What is the transcendental argument for the existence of God? Often referred to just as TAG, T-A-G. And in fact, that's how I'm going to refer to it throughout the rest of this presentation, is TAG. Well, what we're doing is the argument begins at the paradigmatic level to prove that God must exist. Now, this is key. This is key, the paradigmatic level, because I think a good metaphor for this is everybody, when they're looking onto reality, when we're looking onto the world, we're all looking through a window. But many of us don't take account of the window frame, right? The assumptions that are surrounding our perspective. And so this is what this argument is doing, is we're actually taking a step back, we're zooming out a bit, and we're addressing the framework of one's worldview, the framework of the window on which they are perceiving reality. And that's the gist of this argument. And so it argues for the preconditions of experience itself being rooted in God. And without God, there is no justification for those preconditions. Now, you might be asking, what preconditions are you talking about? I don't understand. Well, we're talking about the laws of logic. We're talking about the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, excluded middle, induction itself, which is going to be essential for the epistemology, philosophical term just for knowledge and truth, for the epistemology that is going to be the sole source of knowledge and truth for the atheist, for the materialist, for the scientist, is going to be based on the law of induction, the process of induction, but they're not going to be able to justify it, and that's what we're going to be highlighting. Morality, language and meaning, number theory, and you could go on. These are all preconditions for experience itself. And so the question that's going to be asked of one's opponent, again, theoretically, this is going to be some atheist that we're encountering, specifically a more sophisticated atheist. This isn't just your run-of-the-mill. We're going to be steel-manning their argument here. But the idea is that we're going to be asking the opponent to justify their preconditions, their presuppositions, their a priori assumptions about the world in their worldview? Can you justify them? And so moving to the next slide, where does the transcendental argument for God come from? Well, it gets a little confusing. Like I said, we're not going into the work of Cornelius Van Til, who's sort of a modern theologian who popularized the presuppositional apologetics and the transcendental argument for God. Though that, because the framework of the argument way predates Cornelius Van Til, and if you put in the transcendental argument for God into Google, you're going to get the Wikipedia page, and it's going to tell you, oh, well, it comes from Kant. No, it predates Kant. And so if you've even heard somebody like J. Dyer mention, if you go back into Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he is arguing with the sophists about the law of non-contradiction, the sophists want to argue that the law of non-contradiction isn't necessary, but he highlights, and this is kind of the framework of the transcendental argument, to argue against the law of non-contradiction is to assume the law of non-contradiction in the argument. And this kind of circular feedback loop, this kind of circularity, this kind of inability to see what is being pre-assumed, what their presupposition is before addressing the argument, the comment, the debate, this is what we're going to be highlighting. And so the reason why Kant is often associated as a sort of founder for the transcendental argument is because of his a priori critique of pure reason. Of course, this is his famous work, right? Critique of pure reason. And he critiques it at an a priori level. And who is he critiquing? Well, he's critiquing people like David Hume, right? The ultimate empiricist, skeptic, rationalist, okay? And so what he's doing, and Kant is a hard guy to sometimes get your mind around, so I'm really simplifying kind of his influence and what he's trying to argue. It can be way more complicated than what I'm trying to say, but essentially is that we can't know reality in and of itself because of our a priori preconditions, because the things that we're pre-assuming, these mental categories, these mental preconditions, like space and time, like causation, like language. So the idea, and this of course leads to his famous work with transcendental idealism, but we can't know reality in and of itself because of these a priori preconditions. We say, as people using the transcendental argument, yes, exactly. This is exactly true, but how do you justify those preconditions? And so essentially you could ask somebody, and we're not to the actual debate stage yet in these slides, but can you empirically prove to me the existence of what are called in philosophy called transcendentals, the transcendental categories, language and meaning? Can you prove to me empirically the self, the laws of logic, number theory, morality, truth? It's impossible. These are all a priori presuppositions, even if somebody is only trying to use the scientific method or induction as a justification for what's true. They're still presupposing all these things. And when you ask them in the worldview to justify them, philosophically justify your use of these, they can't. And so what I want to do then is highlight kind of two frameworks when we're approaching this debate, the sort of Platonic model and the Aristotelian model. And so for Plato, and I don't mean to just emphasize on these two figures, but I think that it's really insightful to see how they have two different methods of their philosophy and how these two methods are going to be repeated over and over and over again, even within Christian apologetics, between the classical evidentialist approaches and then the tag approaches, the presuppositional approaches. So for Plato, and I've highlighted this on my series on the development of logos theology, is that he begins at an a priori level, the Platonic forms, the divine mind, the logos, right? And so we've highlighted his idea of the logos. Of course, it's a created demiurge, but he's rooting all these transcendentals inside the divine mind because they're conceptual. Therefore, they only exist in our mind. They must be in a higher mind. And therefore, from that presupposition, from that a priori starting place, then he deduces from there. This is Platonic philosophy. This is very different from the way Aristotle approaches philosophy. He begins with induction. He begins with, for a lack of a better term, empiricism, the scientific method. Of course, all this stuff is going to come later in regards to the history of philosophy and all this stuff. But the the processes are the same. So he's beginning with sense data, your immediate experience. What can you know in the right here, right now, without theorizing, conceptualizing, extrapolating to these large abstract ideas? What can we know right here, right now? Through induction. And then from those things that we can know so that we can know objectively through sense data, then we'll deduce from there. This is the model of Aristotle. And so keep these two models in your mind. The a priori to deduction, the Platonic model, versus the induction to deduction model, the Aristotelian model. And again, we're approaching, we're not Platonic, we're not arguing for Plato, but we're using this model, the Platonic model that I'm trying to highlight here. And so as I mentioned, this is a branch of presuppositional apologetics, arguing in regards to the justification for the presuppositions of one's paradigm. Okay, now tag versus the classical foundationalism or the evidentialist apologetic model. And so this is exactly what I was trying to highlight with Aristotle and his use of induction to deduction. And so for us, using the tag, the transcendental argument for God, the tag works at the paradigmatic level, at the a priori level, and therefore justification for the preconditions of experience, where the evidentialist, building upon scholasticism, building upon the school that was really influenced by Aristotle. I mean, you look at Thomism and Thomas Aquinas, and Aristotle being the philosopher, right? So then they use the inductive to deductive method. Evidentialism works by way of veridical claims, truth claims, empirical evidence to prove the existence of God. And so what are some of these methods then that evidentialist apologetics uses? Well, the historicity of the Bible, the cosmological argument using natural theology, right? Extrapolating theological truths from the observation of nature, the ontological argument, the miracles of Christ, the resurrection, the lives of the apostles, and so on and so forth. This is typically the way in which a Christian apologist approaches their apologetics, is from the evidentialist model. And this is also called the classical foundationalism. Why is it called classical foundationalism? Because the foundation of knowledge is based in induction. And therefore, from induction, you build and build and build from there. It's built on a foundation. The foundation is induction. The foundation is empiricism. The foundation is essentially the same way in which an atheist would know the world, through the use of science. That is the foundation that the evidentialist apologetics is built on, and that's called classical foundationalism. Okay, and it's going to be tied then to the way in which Aristotle does philosophy. So those look like good and strong arguments, right? The historicity of the Bible, the cosmological argument, the ontological argument. But why would a proponent of the transcendental argument for God be against starting one's apologetics there to prove God? Why would that be? Well, I've kind of already answered it, and the answer is you're not addressing the presuppositions of your opponent. If you begin with the evidentialist model, that's the same model that the atheist starts with. That's the same assumption of the world the atheist starts with. The tag argument forces the atheist to justify how he can even use induction. How can he even use logic and reason? How can he even use language and number theory? And so this would be the typical response. So Tag would say the evidentialist model assumes the exact same preconditions, presuppositions, a priori, that are entirely dependent upon the existence of God, but without first acknowledging that to be the case. Of course, if you're a Christian apologist using the evidentialist model, you can do that because they're justified in doing so because they begin with God. But they're not making that explicit to begin with. And so they're playing on the same field with the atheist. They're playing on the same ground that the atheist works on. Therefore, they can always just go back and forth, back and forth. Evidentialism, though true, doesn't challenge an atheist to justify those same preconditions within their worldview, which they can't without God. Therefore, an atheist can go back and forth with an evidentialist regarding the veracity, the truth of a claim, without ever having any justified ground to stand on to make a truth claim themselves, because they're making a whole host of metaphysical assumptions, yet they have no retort for justification. They have no justification for their metaphysical assumptions. And so tag, therefore, in my opinion, and I think this would be true with anybody who uses tag, but I think you guys would agree after we get further along in this process, is tag is a more devastating argument and apologetic to any atheist. The style of apologetic is the argument itself, meaning the transcendental argument for God, the transcendentals. The style of argument, the style of apologetic is the argument. Can you account for your transcendentals? We don't even need to go any further from there. And so the difficulty in this sort of apologetic method is not whether it's true or not, because it's clearly true. If you just have to follow the logic of it. The difficulty is getting your opponent to zoom out, to step away from the window that they're perceiving reality, to see and work at the paradigmatic level. This is really the challenge, because most atheists aren't even at a sort of conceptual framework to look at paradigms. They're so invested within the classical foundationalist model that they've never questioned it. They've never even thought about the preconditions necessary for that to be true, and can they justify those preconditions? And so again, this is the difficulty, getting your opponent to zoom out and see that you're working at the paradigmatic, the worldview level. You're not making, observational claims here. You're working at a theoretical, abstract, a priori level, and this is the difficulty. And so, what are then the criticisms of the transcendental argument for God? And this is where we're going to try to steelman, an objection to this, because if what I'm saying is true, why would any Christian apologist not begin with the transcendental argument for God? Why would they start with evidentialist claims? Well, the obvious critique is that it's circular logic, that the tag argument is continually begging the question, which is a logical fallacy, right? That it's circular logic. It's starting with the presupposition of God ultimately does not prove God, because you haven't proved why start with that presupposition. You're presupposing the thing you're trying to prove. And so at first glance, you'd say, geez, that seems like a pretty devastating critique, that you're just begging the question that by your assumption of God isn't really going to be useful in proving the existence of God. And therefore, you have to start with the classical foundationalist model, right? Well, wrong. Because the same objection would be true for the evidentialist or the atheist with their inductive empirical starting point. They can't even justify that without the assumption of it. And so this is an unavoidable and has already been addressed in mathematical and formal logic. And so it has to do with Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theory, and there should be 2 dots over the O in Gödel, and I apologize, I don't actually have that there. But Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theory has to do with mathematical logic, and basically that you can't have an entirely complete system of formal logic, that it's always going to be incomplete. Why? Because you have to presuppose the thing that you're arguing for. So, for example, reason. You can't prove the existence of reason without rational arguments. You can't prove the existence of numbers without numbers. There can never be a complete sort of systematic loop of formal logic, because that's not it won't work that way. It's incomplete. And the incompleteness theory highlights that you actually have to start with, when you get into realms of formal logic, they're always going to be circular. They're fundamentally circular. And therefore, the thing that you're proving, you actually have to start with. And this is where this argument becomes foolproof, because the only major critique is the sort of circular logic that could be aimed at it. However, we have an out with Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theory, because any formal system of logic begins with the assumption of the thing it's proving, like numbers, like reason. So, therefore, what's going to be important is our theories of truth. And there's kind of 2 theories of truth: the correspondential theory of truth, the correspondence theory, and the coherency theory of truth. And so the correspondential theory of truth, if you're still following me here, is going to be obviously tied to the classical foundationalist model, because the correspondentialist theory of truth basically asserts that truth corresponds to reality. So numbers correspond to the world, words correspond to the world. Things that truthfully happen have a correspondential nature to them. They correspond to reality, to nature, to the world. And this is then how truth works. However, if we're working at an a priori level, if we're working at a presuppositional, a level of paradigms here, a level of worldviews, well, you can't use a correspondential theory of truth because there's nothing it can correspond to, because we're working in a conceptual realm. And therefore, the only resource, or the only way in which we can sort of form truth at the paradigmatic level, is using the coherency theory of truth. And this is essential for how this argument works. We move to the coherency theory of truth, that our worldview is going to be more coherent than the other person's worldview. And so the debate's going to be on coherency, not on correspondence, not on a correspondence of facts and facts and facts. That's a classical foundationalist model. That's the evidentialist model. That's the induction to deduction model. We're going to be working on the coherency theory of truth. And the idea here is that the Christian worldview is the most coherent worldview that exists, particularly the Orthodox Christian worldview, but we'll save that again for another video. And therefore, reverting to a coherence theory of truth, a coherency theory of truth, when working at the paradigmatic level, it follows that the Christian worldview therefore must be true. Starting with the presupposition of God leads to both the tag, the transcendental argument for God, and evidentialist approaches to both be true. However, tag forces the opponent to justify their use of those same transcendentals. And so now let's see how tag works in action. And so here is my theoretical debate with an atheist. We're going to be, I'm putting all this on 2 slides, so bear with me here. I understand that it could be more complex. There's other areas we can move into, but this is just my idealized 2-slide version of a debate with an atheist who's honestly interested in truth. And so in a formal debate, by me asserting the existence of God, I would technically go first, because I'm making a claim. The atheist is making a negative claim, so it's not on them to go first. It's on the person making the claim. And so I say God exists, because without the existence of God, there is no justification or foundation for transcendentals, for space and time, language and meaning, truth, the self, logic, number theory, morality, justice, and so on. For the preconditions of experience itself, without God, there's no justification for those preconditions. And so the atheist, typically, again, not recognizing you're working at the paradigmatic level, says, oh, come on, believing in God is wishful thinking and juvenile. There is only matter, the scientific method, and continual change, evolution, right? Everything is changing, everything is moving. And so just using that logic then, an easy response would be, okay, so how do you know that to be true? Especially if everything is changing, because the statement, the veracity of his first initial claim would therefore insinuate that it's also changing and therefore potentially no longer true. Please justify how anything can be known at all in your worldview. And so Hume, David Hume, who, remember, Kant was addressing with his critique of pure reason, Hume himself conceded that induction, the way in which the sole source of epistemology in the atheistic worldview, the sole source, is unjustifiable in a skeptical atheistic paradigm. Therefore, it just must be assumed. And so Hume himself, the kind of apex of the skeptical, empiricist, atheistic, within the development of philosophy, he's certainly prominent there, concedes that induction is unjustifiable. They can't justify it, so they're just going to assume that it works. And so the atheist would respond saying, well, I know it because it's true. This is what logically follows from empirical scientific investigation, duh. And so he's still not grasping the argument here. He claims he can still use logic, he can still use the empirical scientific method. And so you respond, how can you justify the existence and validity of logic If you only believe in matter to exist, and everything has occurred by chance, if everything is changing by chance, how can you trust a randomly formed human to extract truth from an ever-changing universe? That's illogical. You have no metaphysics. Logic is not material. Therefore, logic is transcendent to matter. How can you even account for matter? You only believe matter to exist. You don't believe in metaphysics. How can you even account for the use of logic? You can't even talk about what logically follows. You can't justify logic in the first place. And so, how is this true, yet you also believe in the inerrancy of mathematics? Mathematics is a numerical representation of logic. And so the atheist kind of starting to realize that what the argument is, that he really doesn't have anywhere to go, would say, well, yeah, okay, logic isn't material, but it is the way the chaotic universe has organized itself, and we objectively just discover this sort of logical pattern. And yes, so I guess some things don't change, like math and logic, but it's possible they eventually could. And so you hear this sometimes from atheists saying, well, maybe in a different universe, maybe in other parts of this universe, prime numbers don't exist. Maybe 2 + 2 = 4 isn't true when you're in a different dimension. Of course, all that is theoretical speculation and not, again, any sort of reliable source of justification in an actual debate. And so moving on from there, we would say, how does a random, purposeless, chaotic universe create invariant laws that only exist conceptually in the human mind? That is illogical. You're presupposing things that can never be demonstrated or proven by science. Yet that is your sole source of epistemology, of knowledge and truth. The sole source is the scientific method, is empiricism, is induction. And yet, again, they cannot account for that. They can't even account for the law of identity. They can't account for any of this stuff because they have no metaphysical framework. And so the atheist would say, well, like Hume, we just have to assume these things or we couldn't know anything. And that's when you have them. You see, because now they're being ad hoc, now they're being arbitrary in their logic. They're going to ask you to justify this and that and this. But when you really get down to the nuts and bolts and force them to justify logic, justify induction, justify the use of numbers, justify mathematics, justify epistemology, justify truth, they can't. And therefore, they just assume those things to be true. And once they do that, you say, exactly. You're presupposing the entire Christian worldview minus the existence of God. You are unable to justify any transcendental because a random materialistic universe doesn't know or doesn't allow for objective conceptual processes and categories. Your worldview is entirely incoherent and contradictory. And so this is really important because the difference here is that you're making one presupposition, the presupposition that God exists. And from there, you can create a whole system of coherency, a whole worldview, a whole paradigm of coherency, and then you can justify metaphysically a lot of these pre-assumptions, these a priori things that Kant was trying to talk about, and how we don't really know reality in and of itself. And so the atheist says, oh, well, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Just assume the existence of the Christian God? You're using circular logic. I might not be able to justify any transcendental, but you can't justify God without presupposing him. Yes, of course. But this is where Kurt Gödel comes back into place here. And so, yes, we are presupposing God to prove God, because Kurt Gödel proved in 1931 that to be the case with any formal system of logic. Any formal system, you can't prove reason without rational arguments or the existence of numbers without numbers. Therefore, it will always end up circular, and therefore you can't prove the existence of God without ultimately starting with the assumption of his existence, just as you do with reason, just as you do with numbers, just as you would do with any formal system of logic. And that's true whether you're using the classical foundationalist model or not. Therefore, your paradigm, the atheistic, non-believing paradigm, has a multitude of unjustified presuppositions, while I presuppose just one thing, the existence of God, in order to prove God, which is not a circular argument because Kurt Gödel says that's true for any formal system of logic. And guess what? My God is the Logos, the source of logic. And that's why it would take on the same schematic, the same architecture that a formal system of logic would take on, because God is the source of logic. Because paradigms are ultimately circular, a coherency theory of truth demonstrates my worldview is incredibly more coherent and therefore must be true. And this is when the atheist, who might, if he's really searching for truth and he's following what's being said here, might say, well, that does make sense. I've never heard anybody argue for God that way. Can you tell me more about this Christian God? I'm interested in learning who he is. And this is then where you begin your evidentialist apologetics. This is then when you bring in the historicity of the Bible, when you bring in the lives of the apostles, when you talk about the resurrection and the miracles, when you get into evidentialist forms of theology and apologetics, because now you have them, you've shown them that even using their own language, using philosophy, using secular tools of reason, that their worldview is entirely incoherent. And really what it comes down to is they're in opposition to God. And if they're really searching for truth, again, is a logoi of God, then you're always going to end back up in God. And so before I go on to my last slide here, what I want to highlight is that, again, I was trying to fit all this onto 2 slides. So yes, you don't have to presuppose the Christian worldview to make this argument. Again, the tag argument is a generalistic argument for theism, for the existence of God. Because of where I'm coming from, because of the way I use it, I said, you're presupposing the entire Christian worldview minus the existence of God, because that's the framework that I'm putting this in. But the argument itself is actually very general. This is for all theism. And so the next slide then addresses that, the implications of tag, that therefore the only debate that should really have is between faith traditions. And then the question is the Transcendentals. They're entirely conceptual and therefore must be rooted in a superior mind. For us, the mind of God, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ. And so how a religious worldview then accounts for these transcendentals as well as cataphatically and apophatically describing God is going to be different among the traditions, even within Christianity. And so let me unpack that statement. How does every religious worldview then account for these transcendental categories? How do they account for reason? How do they account for logic? How do they account for language and meaning? How do they account for truth? How do they account for morality? These are essential. And so when I say cataphatically, those of you may already be familiar with these terms. Cataphatically is just positive, affirmative forms of theology saying what God is. God is love. God is truth. God is wisdom, this type of thing. Those are cataphatic expressions, where apophatic theology, negative theology, where you negate aspects of God. God is beyond wisdom. God is not articulatable. God is beyond language. These are negative approaches to God. And so a good metaphor for the apophatic approach is like carving a statue from a block of marble. You're taking things away from the marble to reveal the beauty of the image that you're going to construct underneath it. And so apophatic theology is trying to do this in terms of coming grips with God by making negative claims. The way in which a faith tradition does this is going to be very different, even within Christianity. And so what this comes down to then, and why Orthodox theology is going to come out superior, is this idea of a simple, singular essence, what in Thomism and Catholic theology is called absolute divine simplicity. And you find this idea throughout it's replete throughout religious systems. Basically, almost all religious systems fall victim to this thing, is that they say God's essence is singular, it's one, and it's simple. And so this image of concentric circles with a dot and concentric circles that you see in the bottom right corner, this is the typical schematics of the Neoplatonic worldview. And the Neoplatonism is kind of the epitome of the Hellenistic philosophical project. And so, again, the things that Plato and Aristotle were working on were sort of synthesized and lead to the sort of theological worldview known as Neoplatonism. And the Neoplatonists used apophatic theology. Okay, this is something that I was discussing with Jay Dyer in a recent conversation we had, that when you look at Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, he was all about trying to get at conceptual understandings of God using a cataphatic claim. God is the source of language. And then he would make an apophatic claim, but God is beyond language. And so he would kind of go back and forth with this dialectic, making a positive affirmation about God and then a negative claim about God, typically in relation to the statement he just made. Now you get to Proclus, another Neoplatonist after Plotinus, and he says, well, God's just beyond reason. There's no point to even do this. Of course, he still did cataphatic, apophatic theology, but he's saying God is beyond this stuff. So, therefore, he's beyond reason entirely. Therefore, how do you even know God? And this is going to be one of the big distinguishing characteristics, again, on why Christianity is going to come out superior. So, this simple, single essence is going to be true with Brahma and the idea of the universe, the kind of universal understanding within Hinduism. Of course, they have a cycle of reincarnation. You're stuck in samsara, and you want to be released through moksha and out of this cycle. But really, it's Brahma. It's the creator of the universe. There is a sort of monotheistic element to Hinduism, even within the multiplicity of its forms. It's polytheism. So Hinduism is going to fall back into the same model of concentric circles, with God being a simple dot in the center. The one, this is Neoplatonism. Like I said, this is where this model comes from. So, of course, they posit that. Allah, Islam, it has the exact same model of Allah. Allah is going to be the single dot. They're going to take a very Neoplatonic schematics and build on that, a Neoplatonic framework. And this is true for Catholicism. The official theology of Catholicism is Thomism, and it's going to take this same sort of schematic, a dot with concentric circles. This is going to be true with paganism, but what we're going to do is just associate the pagan god with creation, with matter. And so that single dot, again, we're just associating something to the essence of God. That's where it all breaks down. Pantheism or panpsychism, it's going to be the same thing. So at least with panpsychism, again, you could use the tag argument to argue for panpsychism. But then when you say, well, it's this universal mind, okay, how does that all work out in regards to then the ontology? How does the universal mind come into existence? Well, did it create itself? Is it eternal? And you're going to fall into a lot of the same problems of, again, the Greek philosophical project. You're going to fall victim to dialectics. And so for anybody interested in this stuff, there's one book that I recommend over and over and over again. It's called God, History, and Dialectic by Dr. Joseph P. Farrell. God, History, and Dialectic. God, History, and Dialectic. And so how does the Orthodox theology overcome this stuff? Why am I saying that Orthodox theology is ultimately the only true religion on the planet? Well, it has to do with their doctrine of the energy-essence distinction. The essence of God is entirely unknowable. But that doesn't mean, like Proclus, that we can't know anything about God then, that it's beyond reason, because God has energies. And the way that you understand me is not by my essence. You don't know the essence of David Patrick Harry, of Patrick, but you do know are my energies and my operations and my actions. The things that I say, the things that I do, the things that I post. That's how you know who I am, and that's how we know God. And so the Logos, the second person of the Godhead, of the Trinity, is composed of the logoi, of these uncreated energies, of language and truth and love and, number theory, we could even say, of the laws of logic. All this stuff are logoi of the Logos. Even the word logic comes from Logos, okay? And then it's our anthropology of the nous, the kind of intellecty of the soul, of the heart, our intellect of the soul, of the heart. This is a unique anthropology that only exists within the Christian world in Orthodoxy. And it's through this nous, it's through this capacity that we interact with God, through personhood, okay? And then I'm going to highlight personhood here in a second, but then this leads to, this absolute divine simple essence leads to where all the heresies in Christianity come from. Sabellianism, the idea that there's no distinction within the Godhead. Of course, we always say that there's three persons, one essence. One essence, three persons. So there's, right there, we have a distinction within the Godhead, right? Well, Sabellianism says, no, ultimately there is no distinction. It's just one. It's just one essence. And it's going to come back to this model, right? Then the Trinity is just going to be that dot. And that dot absolves the personhood of the Trinity. Heresy. Arianism, the idea that Jesus is more human than he was divine. In fact, really, what Jesus is the most enlightened an individual could become on the planet. But he's just human. He was just created like the rest of us. And then he kind of fuses with divine nature through the baptism, through the resurrection or something like that. Or they may just reject the resurrection altogether. Well, it's a logical follow where you would get to Arianism if your schematics of God is this concentric circle model. Because if God is simple in essence, that dot must just be the Father. And so if that dot's the Father, where is Jesus? Well, Jesus must then be the first circle, the first created. And therefore he becomes created. Therefore he becomes human. Therefore we have another breakdown in the Trinity. Or we have Docetism, which says the exact opposite of Arianism, which basically posits that Christ or Jesus was more divine than he ever was human. And the whole kind of human theology is really just symbolic. It's not actual. It's not historical. I mean, maybe people saw stuff, but it's more just symbolic. He was always fully divine. And so, again, that is another logical follow if you're trying to stay within this model, because you're always trying to keep God in that initial dot. And the same thing's true with the filioque. And I know that some of people who are Catholic here may draw objection to this, but hear me out. I mean, the filioque then essentially posits a dyad within that dot. Within that simple dot in the center of those concentric circles, there's the Father and the Son. And the Son has dominion over the Spirit like the Father does. There's a sort of subordinationism to it. And therefore the Spirit kind of becomes the first circle outside that dot. That's the filioque. That is another heresy. And so how do we prevent all these heresies from occurring? How do we know Christianity to be true? Well, it's the Ordo Theology. Again, this is where we start. This is how we know God. This is emphatic in Dr. Farrell's God, History, and Dialectic. Get that book if you find this stuff interesting. So the correct order then of theology, of all theology in our worldview, and therefore which would always lead to orthodoxy being true, is the personhood operations essence. This is how we do theology. And we find out personhood through revelation. And so we begin with the personhood revealed in Scripture. That's how we know God. And we never begin with the essence. That's what Neoplatonism does. That's what Islam does. That's what pagan and panpsychism and pantheism, and that's what Hinduism does. That's what Catholicism does with Thomism. It begins the theology with what is the essence of God. When the essence of God is a logical follow after the operations, which are a follow after the personhood, because we have a personal God. And we have a personal God that we interact with through the Father, the Son, the Logos, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. And so to begin with the essence rejects how we know the biblical God. And this is what I would say is a major implication of the tag argument, and how the tag argument would be continued when approaching another theist in debate. So that concludes this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for listening. I hope you guys now better understand what the tag argument is, where it comes from, how it works in an apologetical format, specifically with an atheist, a non-believer. And of course, I just touched on how this stuff would then, especially from the Orthodox perspective, how this stuff would be addressed with a fellow theist from various world traditions. So thank you guys. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for all the love and support. I appreciate everything and all the kind words I get from you guys. Please like, share, and subscribe this video. Please share this video. Like I mentioned, I hope this becomes one of my more popular videos, because I want somebody to try to, combat my argument. Of course, I don't think they can. Really, the only out an atheist or a non-believer has is say, well, I'm not going to assume God. I'm just going to continue in my line of thought. I'm just going to assume induction. I'm going to assume the laws of logic. I'm going to assume mathematics and number theory. And that's really all they have. And then they have all these assumptions that they can't justify, whereas the theist, but specifically the Christian, specifically the Orthodox Christian, we just have to assume God, and we can take it from there. And so that's the argument. That's the transcendental argument. That's how it works against an atheist. Again, let me know what you guys think. Please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you guys for everything. And until next time, as always, God bless.